Hello Siddhis, welcome to the online English class. Today I am going to take a lesson from the textbook Snapshots prescribed for plus 1 students. The address written by the famous writer Marga Mingo. Marga Mingo is the pen name of Sarah Mingo, who was born in Netherlands. She was a writer and a story writer. Address written by the famous writer and journalist Marga Mingo. First, I would like to tell you the background of the story. This is a very touching story, and the story is set in pre-war and post-war times. That is the time of the Second World War. At the time of Second World War, Holland was defeated by Germany, where 90% of the people were from Jewish community. And the Nazi Germans evacuated all the Jewish people to the concentration camps, since there was no safety and security for life and belongings. Here our narrator's mother, that is Mrs. Yes, in the lesson, she handed over all her valuable and precious things to one of her old acquaintances named Mrs. Darlings. And all the members in the narrator's family were evacuated to the concentration camp by the Nazi army. And among all of them, only Marga Mingo, that is our narrator, have survived. All others did not return from the concentration camp. So here, the story is a poignant account of a daughter's search for her mother's belongings after the war. The story describes how war affects the life of civilians, how it disturbs the normal life and creates conflicts and tension in normal life. This short story is a poignant account of a daughter's search for her mother's belongings after the Second World War in Holland. When she sees her mother's belongings, it evokes a lot of memories in her, but she resolved to forget everything and she decides to move on. Now we will see the lesson. Why did she resolve to forget everything and decides to move on? So go to the lesson. Address by Marga Mingo. When the story begins, we see the narrator in Mrs. Darling's house. So I already told you that the narrator's mother had handed over all her valuable things to Mrs. Darling to keep it very safe and secure during the World War. And so the narrator came to see Mrs. Darling. And Mrs. Darling opened the door and she pretended that she could not recognize the narrator. And the narrator asked Mrs. Darling whether she knew her mother. And at the time, the narrator first time the narrator thought that she was mistaken. She came to a wrong address. But when she saw Mrs. Darling was wearing the same cardigan of her mother, she was confirmed that she came to the right house. She came to the right address. And on seeing this, Mrs. Darling half hid behind the door. And when the narrator told her that she wanted to talk with Mrs. Darling, she told that now it is not convenient time for her to talk with the narrator. So the narrator decides to go back. When she came out, once again she checked the nameplate, and in the nameplate it was written, It was written number 46 Marconi Street, and the address was correct. So the narrator walked back to the station. She was thinking about her mother who had given her the address. It was the time of the Second World War. Once, when the narrator was home for a few days, she could find so many precious things in her house were found missing. So she asked her mother about that, and mother replied that she had given all the valuable things to one of her old acquaintances named Mrs. Darling to keep everything safe and secure. And Mrs. Darling promised that she would return everything once the war ends. And she trusted Mrs. Darling and she handed over all her valuable things to Mrs. Darling. But the author was not entirely convinced about whether Mrs. Darling would return all the valuable things to them. But she didn't tell anything to her mother. And now the narrator had reached the station, and while she was sitting in the train also, she was thinking about the past. So she had arrived at the station without having paid attention to things on the way. Actually, for the first time, the narrator was coming to her hometown after the World War. And she was walking in familiar places again for the first time. And she was upset. And she became upset because the sight of streets and houses full of memories, she was upset on seeing the places and streets full of memories that were connected to her past or that were connected to precious moments of the past. While she was sitting in the train, again she was thinking of Mrs. Darling. When did she first see Mrs. Darling? One day when she woke up late and she came downstairs, she could see her mother was talking with a lady. And the mother introduced that lady to her and she told that this was Mrs. Darling, and she also told her home address, that 46 Marconi Street. That is also fresh in her memory, that address the mother had given her. And the mother also told her, I had handed over all my valuable things to this lady for keeping it safe and secure. Now, after the war, none of the family members returned. I told earlier that they were deported to the concentration camps and none of the family members of the narrator returned. Only the narrator had survived. So, after the war, everything came to normal. They resumed the normal life. First, the narrator did not want to see all the things that reminded her of the past memories. But one day, she was curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address. And she wanted to see them, she wanted to touch them, and she wanted to remember them. Now she decided to go to Mrs. Darling's house for a second time. So that we will be learning in the next class when she went to Darling's house for the second time, what happens. Now again, a quick recap of what we have learned in today's class. The story that's set in the time of Second World War. During the Second World War, the Nazi army deported all the Jewish community to the concentration camp. So the narrator's family was also deported to the concentration camp and only the narrator was survived. And at the time, there was no safety and security for life and property. Narrator's mother handed over all her belongings to one of her old acquaintances named Mrs. Darling. So once the war was over, the narrator was curious to see all the things. She wanted to touch them. She wanted to see all her belongings that her mother had given to keep safely. So when she reached Mrs. Darling's house, she could not recognize the author, or she pretended that she could not recognize the author. So the narrator came back. So the narrator returned from there and she decided to go to that same house for a second time because she was fully confident that that was the same lady, and also she could remember the address that her mother had given her long ago. So here, today's assignment for you: who was Mrs. Darling's? Students, I know you are eagerly waiting to know what happens when the narrator visits Mrs. Darling's house for a second time. So the rest of the story we will be learning in the next session. Till then, bye.